Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of April 8th, and this is your Monday briefing. After a 2-week recess, the Senate is back today. The House returns tomorrow, and one of the many items on their plate, the tax bill.
And joining us to talk about what we can expect in this congressional work period is Andrew Pryor. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And I just want to point out for our viewers that we are not in our studio. We are at the Client Center in our DC office as our studio gets some upgrades. So, Andrew, House Republican tax writers have expressed frustration over the Senate's lack of movement on the House-passed tax package. What action on the tax bill could we see as the Senate returns from its recess?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is the Senate schedule. First of all, as we mentioned, Congress is coming back from a 2-week recess. They're in for the next 2 weeks, then they take a 1-week break for the Passover recess, and then they come back for a 4-week legislative work period leading up to the Memorial Day holiday. There are a number of other priorities that I think take precedent over the tax bill during this 2-week period leading up to the Passover recess, not the least of which judicial nominations. We've got the Senate impeachment trial for Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas. There's also an effort to get a FISA reauthorization in place before the April 19th deadline. And then, of course, there's going to be an effort ongoing to try to do a foreign aid supplemental for Ukraine and Israel. And I think all of that is likely to consume the next 2 weeks and really not leave much of an opportunity for the Senate to take up a tax bill. As you mentioned, the House Republicans and Democrats overwhelmingly passed a bill now more than 2 months ago, and it's languished in the Senate because Democrats and Republicans are trying to work out a bipartisan agreement on a path forward. Republicans have made demands that Democrats have been unwilling to accept. Democrats have made offers that Republicans have rejected. And at this point, as Congress returns, there's no clear indication that there's been any progress over the 2-week recess period. Now, I think we wait, we see what Senate Finance Committee Chairman Ron Wyden might say during this week. We wait to see what Senate Finance Committee Ranking Member Mike Crapo might have to say around negotiations. But ultimately, this rests with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and when he decides to proceed with the bill, with or without a bipartisan agreement. But it may not be an opportunity to take up the bill during this 2-week work period. We may have to wait until Congress comes back until the Passover recess period.
Andrew, the House Ways and Means Committee has scheduled an April 11th hearing to discuss the expiring TCJA tax provisions and the path forward for tax policy ahead of 2025. What could we learn from this hearing?
Well, I think in one sense, this hearing is, I think, designed to mark the April 15th individual tax filing deadline, much as we might, have thought there would be a vote around April 15th on the tax bill, which seems less likely. I think the Ways and Means Committee hearing also, I think, is an opportunity to begin a process that we know is going to be occurring this year, where both the House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee are going to be engaging in a table setting exercise leading up to the 2025 TCJA sunset debate. And beginning to educate members around issues that many of whom were not around when the 2017 tax reform law was enacted. So I think this may be the first step in a series of steps, both public and private, in terms of educating members and beginning to lay the groundwork for 2025.
So, Andrew, I want to turn to a topic that is very much top of mind right now, which is Pillar 2. Acting Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Tax Affairs Scott Levine recently discussed the perceived benefits of the U.S. adoption of a Pillar 2 global minimum tax and continued U.S. participation in the OECD process to share rules through further guidance. What congressional action could we see on the OECD two-pillar initiative as tax writers consider tax policy ahead of 2025?
Thanks, Sindhu. Yeah, I saw those comments as well. And it was notable how many times he referenced Congress's role in the whole Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 process. Obviously, any MLI to implement Pillar 1 would require Senate approval, and any U.S. implementation of Pillar 2 would require U.S. legislation. So very interesting to see him, make that point over and over again in his remarks. Congress, I think, at this point continues to engage in congressional oversight. Republicans have been very, public in their criticism of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 agreement, focusing in on some revenue estimates that come out from the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, showing that both proposals are likely to lose U.S. revenue if implemented. But even Democrats, I think, have raised private concerns and as well as some public concerns in hearings that have been held. But what I would say is Congress' role really right now is just oversight. Most of the activity, if not all of the activity, is occurring at the OECD and Treasury engaging with other members of the inclusive framework in terms of negotiations, both on Pillar 1. We still don't have final text of an MLI, as well as Pillar 2 and further administrative guidance that Treasury, as Scott Levine mentioned, hopes will address some of the ongoing concerns that Congress has raised around things like the treatment of the U.S. tax credit for research and development. But only time will tell whether or not those issues are addressed in a satisfactory manner. But clearly, Congress's input is having an influence over that negotiating process, both on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2.
Andrew, finally, with a little less than 6 months to go before the federal fiscal year end on September 30th, Congress needs to either produce legislation on the 12 categories of appropriations bills to fund the federal government or pass another continuing resolution. What groundwork could we see being laid in anticipation of the next round of negotiations ahead of government funding?
Well, much like elections, we say that the next fiscal year appropriations process begins the day after the last fiscal year appropriations process ends. Obviously, they got the government funding for the fiscal year across the finish line 6 months in. I think the hope is that the FY 2025 appropriation process will run a little bit more smoothly. They do have an agreement in place on the FY 2025 overall discretionary spending levels, although as we saw with the FY 2024 spending debate, we had those discretionary spending levels in place as part of last summer's debt limit agreement, and there were some agitating to go beyond that. But I think there'll probably be a desire to try to stick within the four corners of that at this point and avoid any further government showdowns. One interesting thing to keep an eye on this week, Kay Granger, who is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, right after the House passed the last FY 2024 government funding bill, announced that she's stepping down early as chair. And so there is going to be a House Republican election this week to select a new chair of the House Appropriations Committee. The odds-on favorite is Tom Cole to take over, but that will have to be formalized on Wednesday of this week. And he will have to then also step down as the chair of the House Rules Committee, which is the gatekeeper for floor action, and Speaker Johnson will have to appoint a new chair there. But that'll be a new player, although I think the expectation is that you'll see continuity between Tom Cole and Kay Granger in terms of the appropriations process. So some hope that the FY 2025 appropriations process will move a little bit smoother than the FY 2024 appropriations process did.
Andrew, that's terrific. Thank you so much for your insights and for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And for our viewers, you'll find in the description of this episode a link to the latest Week in Review with Pat Brown. And stay tuned for another Week in Review coming up this Friday.
And thank you, as always, for joining us. And we hope you have a great week. Take care.